I graduated from high school in 1948. I was 18 years old, and I needed a job for the summer and went to work at Vasey Bristol that made baby shoes. They were the cutest, tall little shoes. They were like little tall slippers. And I worked there until they closed. And then when they closed, I went to work on Willow Street for Norwalk Shoe. And I made boxes there also. As a matter of fact, when the mill closed, the first mill closed, they had me, they fixed me a job at the other store so that I could continue working. And then that, let me see, I stayed there until I got married. And then that was the end of my shoe career. That was my very first job doing physical labor. And I really found it very, very difficult. It was the first big job I had, and I thought, oh, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to do this or not. But anyway, it was a very short time that I got used to it, and I really got good at it, evidently, because they were very, very good to me, and I enjoyed it. It was fun. But anyway, the people that I worked with, it was a lot of fun. It was not grueling, and they were very good to the help. I had a great boss. I can't remember her name. I know her name was Betty something. But then I also had some wonderful, wonderful workmates. I worked with a Jeanne Commier, and she made shoes also. When Lawrence Demo was the maintenance man. I remember him very well because he was so helpful when anything that broke down, he was able to repair, and he did a beautiful job with that. And then, let me see, I think that there was a Fred Trottier that was a boss upstairs, and I think that he was the boss of the Stitchers. I'm not absolutely sure, but anyway, he was one of the bosses, I do know that. And Mr. Gatlin was the boss of the whole factory, and he was very, very nice, very distinguished gentleman, and very, very nice. And it was a fun place, and I felt really bad when they stopped working. But then I went to work at the other shoe factory, and Bucky Quinn was my boss at that time, and he was wonderful. He really, treated his help very fairly, and it was very good. So I worked there until I was married, and then I had children and stayed home with them until they were able to be driving themselves places and so forth. Went to work for Dr. Gould. And I guess probably that sums up, what I have done.
After I got discharged from the Navy, I went to the University of Maine. I spent 2 years studying electrical engineering. Well, in the meanwhile, I got married to my wife, and we had a daughter, and I couldn't afford to go to Maine anymore, so I went over to Norwalk Shoe on Spring Street, and I was interviewed by a gentleman named John Powers. So he offered me 50 cents an hour to start. And I said, well, I can't live on 50 cents an hour. And I got up and started to walk out, and he says, hold it. He says, I'll give you 60 cents an hour. I says, okay, I'll accept it. So they took me up in the factory and showed me where I was going to work. So the next day I went to work at 60 cents an hour, and my description of my job was floor boy in a stitching room. Well, I worked there for 3 months at 60 cents an hour. And the foreman they had decided he didn't want to be a shoeman anymore. And he opened up a tobacco factory, tobacco store. So they came to me and they said, Elwin, would you like to be foreman? I said, 3 months, and you want to make me a foreman? So they said they'd pay me $41.25 a week. So I says, fine. So I accepted the job after 3 months as being a foreman. Well, we were making 120 cases of shoes a day at that time. And the shoe factory wasn't too big. So we kept expanding and expanding, and we got up to 400 cases a day at 36 pairs to the case. One year we made almost 7 million pairs of shoes in 1 year, and they were loafers. They weren't no tie shoes or anything until we'd been there a while. We put in a boot section. We made boots with 7-inch high sides, and we had that. And in the meanwhile, in 1951, Uncle Sam says we need an electrician in the Navy. So I got a letter from Zimmer. They give you 30 days to clean up your financial status and report for duty in Boston, Massachusetts. Woke up in the morning on the first day, it's the second day, and we're out to sea. I says, where are we going? He said, we're going to Korea. Oh, nice. So first thing I know, we're going through the Panama Canal, and I spent 15 months in Korea, bombing the coast off and on, and finally I got discharged from them in May of 52. I went back and they said they'd missed me at Norwalk too, so I got my job back, and they had gained a little productivity, but they wanted more, so I kept working it years and years, and finally they made me assistant superintendent. Yeah, after I'd been superintendent for a while, the superintendent retired, and I took over the job. So Harold Alfon decided that I'd done enough at number 2, and they were having problems at their number 4 factory in the stitching rooms. So he sent me over to number 4 to see if I could straighten out the factory. So after I had been there for 2 years, things were running smooth again, and they were having trouble in their North J factory in the stitching room. I was pretty good at being a stitching room man because that's where I was brought up, in the shoe factory. So I went over to J for 9 months. I straightened that place out. And then Harold said they wanted to build a factory down in Alabama. So Jim Dowdy and Jim Dowdy was working in Norwalk at some capacity. So we went down to Alabama. I can't think of the name of the place now, but we put in the foundation, built the factory, hired all the help, got everything running, and after we got things going, they sent me back to Skowhegan. I had met this gentleman I made friends with in Columbus, Ohio, and he had heard that I had quit my job at Norwalk Shoe. So he said, there's an opening. They need somebody that has your experience working at a shoe factory in El Salvador. So they made arrangements for the both of us to fly down, and I was interviewed by the owner and his assistant, and they offered me financially what I wanted. So he said, the job is yours if you'd like it. And I said, well, I've got to ask my family. So we came back to Maine, and we took a vote with my 4 children and my wife, and the vote came out 4-2 to go. The 2 oldest ones were married at the time, and they didn't want us to go to a foreign country. So I ended up in El Salvador. And in the meanwhile, we bought an automobile and a house, and we were enjoying life. And one morning, we had gone to church at the 8:30 Mass, and at the 10 o'clock Mass, some gunmen came in and shot up the church and killed 4 nuns, and we decided then we'd better go back to America. We got ready, packed up, then they sent all my stuff back to Maine, and in the meanwhile, when I got back to Maine, some gentleman from the Bangor Daily News came in and interviewed me about my time in El Salvador, and Harold had got in touch with it. So Harold called me, that's Harold Elfont for Norwalk Shoe, wanted to interview me at his camp out on the Belgrade Lakes. So at the age of 61, I retired, and my 2 younger children, my son was called Skipper. He graduated from Colby while I was there. And the year my youngest daughter graduated from Thomas, that's when I gave my notice. I was only 61. So that's about my experiences with Norwalk Shoe.
When a person was looking for work in the shoe factories, they would go and stand in the corridors of the shop, and the personnel would come in and take whoever they needed that day for a certain job. If you were not hired that day, you could keep coming back until something came up. You did not need to fill out a resume as you do today. After being hired, you needed only to fill out the proper paperwork at the office. My first job was working on what was called hot blasting. My next job was called bottom wash. This was where the shoes were cleaned before being packed. This consisted of washing the bottoms of shoes that may have gotten cement or black marks, etc. There was 36 pairs of shoes on a rack, starting with size 4 and going up to the largest size they made at that time, I think was a size 12. Now I am sure most factories start with a size 6 and up. Very few sizes 4s and 5s are made today. Later I was to work on sock lining. This job consisted of adding a lining in the shoe with the name of the shoe usually printed on the sock lining. You could put several linings in the shoe by lining them up in front of the workplace and then insert them in the shoes. This saved several minutes. I worked on these jobs because I was not yet 18 years old, and that was required before you could work on any machine. Later I was to French cord stitch and backstay. I was usually always on French cord unless there was little work, and because I was the last one on the job, I was the one taken off and moved around to whatever job needed to be done. I guess this is not done today. French card is the material that goes on the tops and around the shoes, and after it's French carded, goes on to a job called turning. This is where the French card is turned with glue and goes to the next job that is called one roll, where the French card is stitched in place. In those days we worked in whatever jobs we were needed. Now one will no longer do that. I was glad just to be able to work. I had several jobs when French card was low on work, as there were 8 or 9 girls working on this job. Also at this time only women did these jobs. Not sure today if men are hired for this or not. We were busy and worked hard, but also found time to have fun and make many new friends. We are still friends today and try to keep in touch whenever possible. Work days were either 8 hours or 9 hours long, depending on the job and what work needed to be packed and shipped by that day. My husband was a plant manager, and many nights had to go back into the shop late at night if there was a third shift working, and sometimes there was, but not often. There was at one time a new lasting machine, and there were often problems at the beginning with this machine to iron out the problems. He could be gone for 2 or 3 hours depending on the problems. And I should add that I only worked about 5 or 6 years in the shoe factory.
I worked for Norwalk Shoe for some 25 years, starting out as a piece worker. Then several years after I was hired, I was promoted to a foreman, and I worked for, not indirectly for Harold Althorn, and Harold was one to work directly with his supervisors. And when I was a foreman, he called me into his office, and he told me that he always starts his foreman off at $75 a week, but because I had a future in the shoe business, he was going to start me off at $85 a week. In one of my positions, after I worked there for about 10 years, I worked out of Norwich Walk for a couple of years, and I used to take Harold around to different factories when he had meetings and so forth. And I remember back then that I had a 1957 Chevrolet. It was a beautiful car, but if you shut it off and try to start it up again, shortly after it wouldn't start until the engine was cooled off. And one time, Harold and I sat in the car for 20 minutes in a 0 temperature, and he says, "Paul," he said, "why don't you trade this car in?" And I told him that I would trade it in if you give me a raise. And I believe Harold did a lot of good things that nobody hears about. He used to give out trips to ball games to anyone that worked for him, being the Red Sox or the football team, the Patriots in Boston. He sent umpteen people to the World's Fair in New York. I can't remember what year it was. And that was a 3-day trip.
63.
All expenses paid. And he done a lot of things for people that were down and out. Like I say, a lot of things you never even hear about. But I think he was a generous man in his own sense of the word. He was hard to work for because he was very demanding. But I believe if you done your job right, that he would treat you like anyone else. Harold was one to have outings for his office people and supervisors every year in Belgrade. And he would put on a great feed and also play games. One of the games he played was bingo, and he used to give out prizes of $100 or $500. And I was fortunate to win a prize of $100. And the following week, when Harold came around the factories to give out the prizes. He called me into his office and he handed me a $100 bill. At that time, it was the first $100 bill I ever saw. But I took it out of his hand and I almost tore it in half because he held it so tight. Okay, one other thing that Harold used to give out turkeys to all of the people that worked for him. And I was involved with my superintendent on taking these turkeys to Athens and Fairfield or wherever the people lived, and visiting these people in their homes and handing them a basket of turkeys with all the fixings. And that's one thing that he done every single year.
I started working at Norwalk Shoe in the last part of '58. I worked, when I first started, I worked in the box factory, putting covers on shoe boxes. Those things, boy, every noontime, they would come like mad. You had to work like that to keep them from going on the floor. Then I went into the office. I worked in the office for payroll. I did payroll for quite a few years. Then I would have to go upstairs. I'd have to go out in the factory whenever they made mistakes on their slips. We'd have to take it out to the workers and have them fix it. Every time I was going to have a child, I would go back to work, but I would have to work in the factory until an opening came in the office. So I worked on sock lining, putting sock linings in the shoe. I worked on washing bottoms, which I did like that job. And that's what I would do every time until I'd go back into the office. The pay was, to us back then, the pay was pretty good. I would clear up maybe $47 a week. And if I got to work overtime, which I did most of the time when I was in the office, I would get $57 a week. Because then we thought that was a lot of money. My favorite part of working there was when I would go out and work on the switchboard from 11 to 12 while Sally took her break. And I really did like doing that. Once in a while I'd have to go to Norwich Walk or number 4 to help out. But I can't remember what year I got done. That's it.
My name's Larry Bono, and I'm the oldest son of Virgil Bono, who worked for Norwalk Shoe and Dexter Shoe many, many years. It's kind of interesting because my dad was a foreman and worked for Norwalk for a long time with Norman Worth. And Norman decided to leave Norwalk and go with Dexter Shoe, and had told my father when he left that he would be back for him. My father kind of didn't believe that would ever happen, but I remember Norman pulling into our driveway one night and talking with my dad and told him that he'd like him to leave Norwalk Shoe and go to work at Dexter Shoe in Skowhegan, Maine as a stitching room supervisor. There were 5 of us kids, and he had worked for Norwalk many, many years, I think 20 or so, and he was uncertain whether he should accept the position or not. And I remember him talking to my mother, and with 5 boys to feed, he came up with this plan that he was going to give them what he thought was an exorbitant amount of money to go to work for Dexter. And lo and behold, they accepted his offer. So he actually left Norwalk and came to Dexter Shoe, and he ran the top 2 floors in Skowhegan. From all my understandings, he was adored by the women that worked for him. I see a lot of people where I work now, and they're like, your father was Virgil? Oh my God, I loved working with him all those years. So my story with Dexter started when I was a junior in high school. I would work occasionally pulling lasts. I worked the overnights where we would restock all the shelves for all the materials that needed to be put in the shoes the next day. Everything was very organized because those workers had to be able to pull those materials and get them to the floor where they needed to be in a timely manner so the production line would stay operating as it should. So I worked there my junior and senior year, and then it came time for me to make a decision when I graduated. What was I going to do? And quite honestly, my parents didn't have the money to send me to college. I didn't have the money to go to college. So one night, my father came home and he said, I want you to write a letter to Harold Alphon explaining why you want to go to college. And I actually did that, and lo and behold, got a call, or my dad did, that Harold wanted to meet with us in Dexter. He and I drove there, and I met in a conference room. I honestly don't remember the man's name, but it was Harold's son-in-law at the time. And we spoke for a while, and then they left and came back into the room and said, we've decided that we will pay for your education. All 4 years, room and board, books included. There were no strings attached. So off to the University of Maine at Machias I went after I graduated. They kept their word. They paid everything. I kept my grades up. I did very well in college. And they did this for 4 years. I graduated in May of 1982 with a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration. My dad couldn't have been prouder. After that, the economy was really bad then in 1982. Housing interest rates were 18%. There were no jobs to be found. And I remember, I don't quite know how it worked out, but I ended up getting offered a job at Dexter Shoe even before I graduated. Didn't have to accept it. It wasn't a precondition for them paying for my college. But they wanted me to go into their management trainee program. I accepted that and started in May of 1982, like 2 weeks after I graduated from college. I worked first in the payroll department and learned that department fairly well. And then I moved on to the retail department because Dexter Shoe owned 70 some odd Dexter Shoe factory outlets at the time. I went from retail to accounts receivable, ran that department. Then I went from there to becoming the assistant controller of the company. Did that for a while. But with my education being in business administration with a major in marketing, I wanted to use that. So I asked, someone had transferred. They were opening new stores in Florida. One of the men that was in the retail office at the time transferred to run and start the Florida stores. And that created an opening. And I had mentioned to Bill Roberts at the time that I was interested in perhaps pursuing that position that had been left vacated. And they gave me the opportunity. During that time, we grew the business to almost 100 stores. I took care of all the marketing needs, posters, advertising, and it kept me busy. Plus I helped run the 18 stores in Maine. I was an assistant state supervisor. I worked closely with Harold Alphon on many occasions. We started the Seeds of Peace, which I don't know if anybody really knows what that is, but it's an organization that helps bring the Palestinians from their country over to our country to go to a summer camp and try to teach that it's possible to live in harmony with other people, and that has grown and grown and grown and is still in existence today. Harold gave a lot of money to different organizations over the years that I worked there. It wasn't widely known. He'd like to keep things close to the vest. But I can assure you, his, cooperation with the University of Maine, in Orono, Colby College, and many others, they received a lot of money from him. But he always had the attitude that I'll help you, but you've got to help yourself. So he never gave handouts. He would say, I'll give you X amount of dollars or I'll match what you make. So he never just kind of gave it. He made them work for it as well. Harold and his family and Peter Lunder, who was the president of Dexter Shoe, also the nephew of Harold Alphon, were tremendously great people. They cared about their employees. You were not a number. You were Larry. You were Bob. You were Samantha. You were, when you saw them, it was like you were family. And it's hard today to work for other organizations because most of them now have gone to corporate greed and you're just a number. But with them, you were a name. They truly cared about you and your family. If you saw Peter Lunder walking through the factory, he'd say, how's your wife? How are the kids? And he'd take time to listen. So I worked for them for 21 years in the Dexter plant. I was, in the executive offices, and it was a great honor, quite honestly, to work with them, and I enjoyed every minute of it. Unfortunately, shoes being made in the United States kind of went by the wayside, and Peter and Harold's attitude was, if we cannot produce shoes in the U.S., we will close the doors, and that's exactly what happened. And I left their employ in 2001 when they started closing all the outlets. So that's my story.